For many of us, it probably seems like video games have been around since the beginning of time. While this isn't true, the first video game, Pong, was created in 1972. It's been over 40 years since the first video game was created, and the technology has come a long way. The video game mania has certainly been around for just as long. When Nolan Bushnell and Alan Alcorn first released it, the arcade game literally broke because it was jammed with too many quarters being used on it. By 1975, Atari had released their own home version of Pong, which was sold through a Sears catalog because they couldn't get any toy companies to back their product. Just 2 years later, Atari began selling their first video game, aka the Atari 2600. It included a joystick, cartridges, and color games, and it sold to millions of Americans. This created the ability for any person to become a video game player in their own home, and set an example for essentially every video game and console to come. Some of the first video game consoles include the Atari, the Nintendo Entertainment System, aka the NES, and the Sony PlayStation. The Atari ran from 1977 until quite recently in 1992, when it was finally discontinued. It was the first true at-home console, players being able to switch out games and use the system whenever they liked. Its most popular game was Pac-Man and an offshoot called Miss Pac-Man. While the Atari may not have lasted, the creators did establish the first ever pizza-serving video game arcade. Now known as Chuck E. Cheese, the then-titled arcade was known as the Pizza Time Theater. It was the first ever family-style restaurant to include food, entertainment, and video games, and left a lasting impression on the public. The next big console of the time was the NES. It was the best-selling console during that time, and it was a big component that served to reinvigorate the gaming industry after the video game crash of 1983. Video game revenue had dropped from almost 97% from 1983 to 1985, resulting in a big loss to the industry. It led to many companies going bankrupt, including Atari, which had been the frontrunner until that point. There were many reasons that led to the crash, but it was likely due to several. The competition from the home computers, inflation, and the sheer fact of there being too many consoles flooding the market. Luckily, when the NES was released in 1985, it became so incredibly popular that there was a resurgence of video games and consoles being sold to the public once again. After the NES was released, the SNES came out as a revamped version, which was equally as popular. Following the SNES, the next major console was the Sony PlayStation, which is still being used to this day. It was introduced in 1994, much later than its predecessors. The PlayStation 2, which came out shortly thereafter, is the best-selling console to date. It has spawned several other consoles, including handhelds known as the PSP and the PS Vita. The PlayStation was originally meant to rival the Nintendo console when Nintendo broke off their partnership with Sony, but it quickly built its own niche in the market. This leads us from strictly console gaming to other forms of gaming. While Sony was still working on their at-home console, Nintendo was busy creating the Game Boy. Released in 1990, it was the first ever commercially sold handheld gaming console, and it eventually led to what we now know as the Nintendo DS. Some of its major game titles include The Legend of Zelda and the Super Mario series. And speaking of the games themselves, there are many prominent games that have become classics over the years. Pong and Pac-Man certainly left an impression, but Dig Dug was another game that featured a tunnel-digging character that killed monsters. It was so popular that it was released over several different consoles before being discontinued. Moving on to more contemporary games, we find ourselves with Sonic the Hedgehog, the Super Mario Bros., and The Legend of Zelda. Sonic and Mario were both side-scrolling games introduced by separate companies, and all three games have many sequels and offshoots on different consoles. What makes all of these games notable is their playability. Players could beat the games and go back through again on different difficulties for a completely different gaming experience. Moving on to other classic games, we have the Final Fantasy series, The Last of Us, and Halo. Now, these games don't have anything in common plot-wise on the surface. Halo is a first-person shooter, The Last of Us takes place in a post-apocalyptic world, and Final Fantasy is, of course, a generic fantasy adventure game. What they do have in common, however, is the quality of the gaming experience. They all boast fantastic graphics and have been ahead of their contemporaries in the industry. While this may not seem like a big deal, it's coupled with good plots and interesting gameplay dynamics, making them like catnip to the players. Right now, the gaming industry is changing. Earlier this month, Microsoft released a statement saying that their company and Sony would be teaming up to let users play against each other across different consoles. Until now, this has been unheard of and could change gaming drastically. Players can use different consoles, including PC, to play together. Moving on to the future, virtual reality gaming seems to be what's next. There are already several proto systems that are utilizing the concept, most notably the Oculus Rift. These are not widely available to the public, but there has been a lot of talk amongst gamers and popular gaming YouTubers as well. It makes sense that virtual reality is the next big installment. Most gamers want to be as immersed in the gaming experience as possible, and so this would enhance that aspect. It would be like being in the game. So to conclude, we should end by commenting on how popular video gaming has become. While it took a nosedive in the 80s, gaming has come a long way from the original Pong, and based on its popularity, it should continue to fully immerse itself into our everyday lives.